Hello and welcome to another Trench Crusade painting tutorial. Today we're looking at the werewolf. I'm getting a jump start on Halloween early and starting to get into that kind of spooky season vibe. And this one is a really cool miniature and I'm going to try something new today. I'm starting off with a basic Zenithal prime, so I've primed in black and I've hit the model from roughly 45 degrees and got as much white on there while still retaining some of those details. The next step is covering the whole model in a gloss varnish and leaving that to dry for roughly 24 hours. What this is going to do is it's going to lock in that Zenithal prime, but then be a great primer for a mineral spirit like this one. I'm using a dark umber pin wash. It's an enamel wash, and just applying that to the model, you can kind of see that it's just wicking away from those raised areas and sinking into those recesses. This is exactly the method I was hoping to achieve here, and being able to create kind of an all-in-one wash that's just going to cover the whole model but pull away from those raised areas. And once that wash has been on the model for roughly 10 minutes, I'm going to take a paper towel with some of those odorless spirits on there and just start dabbing away and pulling away some of that wash in those darker areas. You can see I'm not applying too much pressure, just dragging the towel over the top and just sucking up all of the excess wash. I don't want to pull too much away because I still want that shading in place, but I'm just making sure that it's not pooling in those areas that it's going to be too heavy. I'm also using a Q-tip for this as well, just to kind of get into those smaller areas and just pulling away that excess. The overall goal is to create kind of a underdrawing, if you like, ready for the next set of colors. So because I still want to be able to see those symbols and some of those smaller details, I'm just adding in just a small amount of the wash back in, just so you can see roughly those sigils on the armor, but making sure that the Zenithal is still showing through. And once that's been given 24 hours to dry, you can see it's created this chalky finish that's really covered up that original gloss. So we're going to dive right into the speed paints. For this one, I'm using Crusader skin, and I'm just applying this to the fleshy parts of the wolf, so around the legs, the chest. And what this is doing is it's using that undershade as kind of a guide for the shadows and highlights. And it's a little dark right now, but I'll be building that up in tones in a minute. And what's great about this method is it's creating a natural light source using that Zenithal, using that wash, and you don't have to build this up in highlights too much. You can just let the speed paints do their work. For the fur, I'm using Runic Grey, and you can really see on the fur here it's starting to tone the overall color of the model, but not necessarily completely recolor and undermine all of that undershading that we've done. I'm also not being too careful about accuracy here. I'm just kind of covering the model for now. While these speed paints dry, they mix really well together, they kind of blend. So I'm just letting those colors kind of mix where the fur meets the skin. For the armor, I'm going to be taking a different approach again. This time I'm using an ink to shade this. This is Inktense Chestnut, and I'm letting that undershade just kind of dictate where the shadows are, while toning the overall color into this nice chestnut color. You could use a contrast paint if you wanted to stay within the family of products, but I wanted to use something just a little bit stronger, which is normally your inks. For the pipes underneath the chin, I'm using Ratling Grime. This is a great mixture of black and brown, and I didn't want to go straight black. I wanted to stay in this kind of warm color spectrum, so just using that just to outline those pipes and on the body as well. And I'm revisiting the armor, this time with some brown leather. This is just a straight acrylic paint. And I'm using a sponge just to dab this on into some of these smaller areas. What I'm trying to achieve is a rust without having to resort to like rust paints. You could, if you wanted to save time, use a built-in kind of rust paint, but I'm trying to achieve that effect without using your standard colors. I'm painting all the nails in coal black and just making sure that I tidy up some of those smaller details. The nice thing about the wash is it's done most of the work for me, so I don't have to worry about underneath the model or any of the smaller areas. And here I'm using some bright neutral grey, and I'm adding some natural chips and damage to the armor plates. I'm using some light pressure on the brush to create some scratches as well. You could use a metallic here, but I'm just trying to do this whole model with non-metallic colors. I find that if you gently dot rather than completely line the edge of the armor, it creates a much more natural looking scratch or damage to it. And to add a speck of color to the armor, I'm using Nihilakh Oxide. This is a patina kind of paint, so it's very, very watery, and it just helps to kind of tone the overall model. You could use something like a turquoise contrast paint here and create some of that oxidized copper. This also adds a little bit of interest to the color, so it's not just so monotone. I'm feathering some of these edges with some damp brush just to help get rid of that tea stain outline. I've decided that the flesh needs just to be up a notch in color, so I'm using some Kalahari orange, and rather than just covering up all the work I've done so far, I'm just using this on some of the highlighted areas. This helps add some warmth to the flesh and just kind of brings this out as much more vibrant. You can see I'm leaving the wash in the shadows and just covering up these highlights here. I'm mixing in some basic flesh just to kind of create my highlight scale. And I'm not worried about being too accurate. These are kind of sketchy highlights. I'm just kind of dabbing on and building up to that basic flesh color. I'm making sure that I focus all of my highlights roughly towards the top of the model or towards the outside of the model. I don't want to highlight anything on the inside. Here's some of that bright neutral grey for highlights on the fur. And again, I'm still quite happy with the way that the wash has done most of the work for me, so I'm just choosing some key areas just to add these specular highlights. I'm using some bold titanium white as my brightest highlight, but I'm making sure that I only use it on the tips of this fur here. I don't want it to be overly bright or overly highlighted. For the base, I'm using AK's Wet Ground. I've used this on all of my Trench Crusade minis so far, so this is kind of the theme of the army. And I'm just applying this with a small spatula and just letting it take its time and dry. It can be pretty messy, so I don't mind covering up some of those smaller details on the rocks. It helps create kind of a more natural base, and it makes the environment look a little bit more mixed in. Once that's dry, I'm just adding a tone to the rocks themselves. This is some of that chestnut ink from earlier. I'm just making sure that it's just muted and it doesn't detract from the model itself. And then I decided to cover all of the elements on the base with some Agrax Earthshade. This is just a brown wash that kind of brings it all back down. It makes the browns look a little bit more different to the browns on the armor, and it just kind of covers and shades the whole thing just a little bit darker. I'm adding some final highlights to this iron girder with some of that grey that's still left over on the palette. and just building up to that neutral grey using some specular highlighting. Finally, for the skulls, I've mixed some of that chestnut in with some whites and greys and created kind of a tan colour. You could use something that's a little bit more straight out of the bottle, but this is just left over from the palette. And for the muzzle and the hands, I'm using a sponge just to splatter on some Slaughter Red contrast paint. I don't want to go too overboard, I quite like this being a little bit more subdued. You could really cover this whole guy in blood if you really wanted to, but I'm just leaving it to the face and the hands for now. The last thing left to do is to paint the rim of the base in coal black. And here he is. This was a very, very simple paint job, but I wanted to spice it up and try something different, try some new techniques. I really did enjoy covering the whole model in a gloss and then covering it with a wash on top. That was a really fun technique to use. The only downside is the drying time, and although the painting, I saved time there, I did waste a lot of time just waiting for the model to dry to move on to the next stage. So that's just one thing to be aware of. But overall, it's a very, very effective way of getting a nice gradient without having to paint in those highlights. And at the end of the day, we've got another recruit for the Trench Crusade army. As always, please let me know what you think down in the comments below. Is this a technique that you've tried before? Or who do you think I should paint next in the Trench Crusade roster? A big thank you to the patrons and the YouTube members. Thank you for making it this far in the video. As always, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and if you want to see more similar content like this in the future. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you all in the next one.